So in lieu of reading bios, which can be a lot because we have so many accomplished folks on here, I would love if we just took a minute down the line to talk about your background, what brought you to the work that you're doing today, and the journey that brought you to trust and safety. Feel free to start, Camille.
I thought I was going to avoid that. All right. I thought you put me on this panel because I'm the next generation.
Yes, we're all the next gen.
So today I run the trust and safety team over at Niantic Labs. I've been in this field for a little bit longer than I care to admit. And, I'm often asked, how is it that I fell into this field? And I think it's kind of the Alice in Wonderland story of one day I saw the rabbit, I thought it was fascinating, I followed that curiosity, I found the first cave. In my context, I was working on countering violent extremism, mostly with Google, and then I sort of like continued following my curiosity wherever it led me, and many years later, I'm still in the field, absolutely loving what is it that I do for a living, which I agree is a weird job. And I also have the great privilege of teaching trust and safety over at Columbia University and of leading some of our research work, including some of the work that my colleague Juliet was just talking about. I think we're very excited to build both the next generation of leaders, but also the next generation of tools, and to sort of bring about some of the innovations that I think we all feel are much needed in our field. So it's not a real answer to your question, but I'm not sure how I got there. I'm very happy I'm here, and I'm happy to also bring about friends and colleagues into ushering the next generation of our field.
I think I'm going to be on the same kind of path. I'm not sure how I landed here, but I was actually a diplomat. So a senior diplomat for the Singapore Foreign Service, and I served in Delhi and also in Berlin. But one of my identities is that I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. And then I wanted to leave the Foreign Service in order to then work in this space. And I did that. I worked with the Nobel laureate Kailash Satyarthi in India and founded my own nonprofit in Singapore. And that was how I became one of the first women from Asia to be on the Twitter Trust and Safety Council. And I think most of you know the rest of it. Basically, when Musk got on board in October 2022, I waited a month, and the rise in hate speech against Black people went up by 202%, not 22, but 202. Against Jews, within 2 weeks, it went up by 61%. Against gay people, it went up by 58% within a month. We cited this in our press release, explaining why we were resigning. There were 3 of us. And I was trying to get as many as council members to resign along with me. Anyway, in the end, 3 of us did. The US media was very tired of him. The news was everywhere. Musk then instigated harassment against the 3 of us on Twitter. We received death threats and doxing threats. I told Harvard about it. I don't think professors in my school knew what doxing was or what being viral was. And Musk then fired everyone else on the council. So I decided to pivot my work, which was really on child trafficking in India. My thesis was really going to be on that. And I now have just defended, which is why Sandra was congratulating me back in March. I was working on a taxonomy of network harassment. So basically categorizing it, quantifying it, and looking at thresholds for platforms. So this is where I'm now. I'm graduating, walking the stage next week. So yeah, and over to my colleagues.
All right, I think I know how I got here.
Please, somebody tell us.
No.
Let's hear it.
It's a very crazy path. Hi, everyone. So for me, I actually come from the political world. I worked on campaigns. I worked in the U.S. Senate, and then decided to make a crazy decision and go into foreign policy. And my thesis at the time was about how social media platforms, specifically Facebook, was the perfect breeding ground for violent extremists. And so I studied the psychology of jihadists. And for me, I was hell-bent on taking all the information, all the research that I had, and giving it to people at State and on the Hill. And I got a call from someone at Meta. It's like, do you want to join our global operations team doing regulatory escalations? And I said, I have no idea what that is. And within 3 months, things started to ramp up for the US 2020 election. A lot of people didn't have a political background, and so I kind of voluntold myself and other people that I was going to join this effort and ended up leading the war room for about 8 months. And then after that, I actually joined the team that created Facebook's oversight board. So I led learning and development for the oversight board and for all the staff. Thank me, hate me, whatever, but...
I'll thank you. It's my job.
I'm glad you're here. And then I led global strategic engagement initiatives for the governance team, because governance is still something that is like out of grasp for most tech companies. And after May, I ended up as a fellow at the Integrity Institute, focused on partnerships, and then ended up doing some work with another tech company focused on elections. And so right now I track all the trends and trying to understand where bad actors can really use AI tools and impact elections. So everything from Indonesia, Thailand, India right now, tracking EU, US, all that fun stuff. So that's how I ended up here. I think that's pretty linear.
Cool. I'll try as well. My BA is actually in English literature. 3 years out of school, I was a tutor in a public school and playing guitar at a Potbelly sandwich shop. Neither of which were especially lucrative, if you can imagine. But I ended up moving to New York, and I got an entry-level job at a market research firm doing basically like brand reputation stuff for like airlines and home electronics. From there, I got a job at a company called Storyful, essentially doing market research work, but with like social listening tools and kind of using this like research methodologies that I had picked up there. You know, I learned about like survey research and focus groups and things like that, applying some of that to social media data, which if you spend any time doing any like social listening, you'll find is like very messy, and it's not very many steps from like trying to figure out what people are saying about Oreos to like seeing just the worst, I'm not gonna swear, like, but like from 4chan or whatever. And so while I was there, I met someone, Ben Decker, who started Memetica, which is a small digital investigations firm. I had worked with him a little bit. He had done some pioneering work on disinformation and extremism. We had collaborated a little bit, so when he started his own thing, I ended up joining him. There, I had the opportunity to do some more public-facing work with media organizations like the New York Times, other organizations, Global Disinformation Index, Institute for Strategic Dialogue. That put me in contact with a broader community of researchers, as well as my now boss, Naomi Schiffman, who was working at CrowdTangle at the time. So when she spun off to start the data and implementation team at the Oversight Board, and she needed people with like skill set, I was well positioned to apply, went through, did some writing tests and a series of interviews, and eventually got where I am now.
Yeah, I'd love to stay on the skill set point, because I think there are transferable skill sets from, you know, me being a social science major myself. Like, there are transferable skill sets that can go into tech. I would love to know what you found valuable in your current positions from the past, and what you think you kind of upskilled as you went through your role.
Should I like start and then bounce it back? Yeah, so I mean, basically from starting when I got my market research job, I just started picking up like light technical skills at that time. I'm now like, you could kind of call me a data scientist. I'm uncomfortable with that title, but at the time I was learning like, you know, Excel 201 or like 102, I don't know, pivot tables, things like that, and being able to work with a mix of structured and unstructured data. This is something that I think is very common across lots of different industries. You don't have to become like a technical person, and also that's obviously not the only path within trust and safety, but I would just isolate that as a little bit of a skill set that I ended up leaning into, and that like if you can get over the hump of being like, oh, I'm not a data person, or that I don't touch that, I think you can open up a lot of doors for yourself that way.
Yeah, I think for me, the art of diplomacy and translation, coming from a political background and being able to work with so many cross-functional partners who do not want to see your team succeed, I had to learn the art. Okay, everyone's laugh. Everyone knows what that looks like, but the art of diplomacy, but then the art of understanding what the chessboard looked like, which I think is something that we always talk about, like the forest through the trees. But when you understand the chessboard and what certain people want, then you're able to move forward. And that's something that I've carried with me throughout all of my different.
I just want to build on that too. Having been a former diplomat, you actually learn how to read the room. For me, because we have to deal with, say, my president or the prime minister, and then try and see how we can, pitch something or do something in terms of communication that would actually target the audience, right? And so the prime minister saying something to a different audience, how do we write that piece of communication? So really put me in really good stead to kind of do the work that I'm doing now. I'm really interested in research translation work. So research, that's good. Let's get it published. Yes, what happens about impact? What happens next? How do we talk to policymakers? How do you do the elevator pitch? Because I have met Henry Kissinger in an elevator. True story. And so if you meet someone in an elevator or you have that 3 minutes opportunity, what do you do about that kind of opportunity? So all those things actually, I think, put me really good stead for the kind of work I'm doing now.
I'm just thinking, I don't think I want to be stuck with a Kissinger in an elevator, but yeah. So, it's interesting because my original field actually is cybersecurity. And so I got to come to trust and safety thinking about what I can translate from cybersecurity, which in many ways is a little bit of a bigger sister discipline, right? I think of trust and safety as the little sister of this field. And from this, I took all the work that the cybersecurity field had done, including from an organizational perspective, in coming upstream from the product development lifecycle. And so a lot of work on safety by design can take after the work from security by design. A lot of work on red teaming, of course, can take after what cybersecurity has to teach us. But also this idea that a field sort of had to consolidate, and how do we organize ourselves to structure best practices, to teach, to grow, to share tooling, and to really mature as a field and as a discipline. I think I really benefited and lucked out from having that that entry into the field.
I think that is a great segue into the next question, because there are so many technologists in the room and students with technical backgrounds. I don't like the binary of technical and non-technical. I think social scientists have technical skills, but to say the least, there are technologists in the room and technical students who often come into these ethical spaces and feel like they're not being spoken to, or things are not resonating as much as more policy-oriented folks. And I would ask, what would we say to them to engage them in more ethical pathways from the beginning, to make it a more linear path into responsible tech?
I can hop in there, I think. Basically, I don't blame any technologist who doesn't feel totally spoken to in this space. I think, to your point, Sandra, there is kind of a binary setup or some kind of false dichotomy that essentially technologists just build with absolutely no regard for humanity, and then ethics people just want to put limits without actually understanding how technology works. And of course there's extremes to everything, but that's really just not how the world operates. We actually need people across the entire spectrum of all kinds of different skill sets, and specifically people who can communicate to others. I'll just reference the work of the board a little bit. So the board, as an example, the board took a case around, there was an image of a nude, ostensibly female breast in the context of raising awareness about breast cancer. And so this was an allowable form of nudity even at the time the board took the case, but the content was removed because an automated system couldn't detect the text on the image at the time, whatever classifier was being used. So the board needs to be able to communicate out, okay, first of all, you have to restore this content, but also we're going to make some recommendations. That's done through a really complicated kind of Q&A process with people at Meta who ultimately need to action some of that feedback. At the end of the day, there have to be people who can, governance folks who can communicate to people on engineering teams who aren't necessarily the most familiar with ethics work or the work of the board, something that we'd like to improve over time, and then ultimately action that feedback so that now that classifier can interpret text. We now have word and data to demonstrate that they actually are better at routing some of this content for human review and reducing some of the errors in that context. And all along that complicated chain of telephone, we need people with every range of skill set, and specific. If you have that skill set, I would say lean into how to play that game of telephone. It's first and foremost an advantage. So lean into that and learn as much as you can to be a kind of bridge, because that people are always looking for bridges.
And also, just coming from academia, I kind of want to push back against how we look at knowledge production. So in a way, if we frame the conversations about today, our now, I think we're not, right? We want to talk about the future. We want to talk about the future that we are excited about, or what that looks like for our children and the people around us. So for me, it's also about your lived experiences and what you can bring into the room. And maybe that's not accepted where you are, where you currently stand, your company or your org. But I argue it's also a very important piece. And so I also work on a thing on indigenous AI. I identify as an indigenous woman. And I think we need to have more of such voices in this room in order to kind of not talk what we're talking about here. It shouldn't be binary. As indigenous people, for example, we look at things on a spectrum. And so I just want to encourage a bit of that too, just looking forward and then looking back to see where we are. And then if we need to disrupt things, we should.
So I am but a humble vessel, and I thought that maybe you would ask this question. So I did the lazy thing, which is I turned to my wonderful students. Some of them are in this room, and I said, hey, what do you guys actually need, in order to feel like you're fully empowered to have a successful career in this field? And it's interesting because I think that as a field, we managed to sort of share this idea that there are many different pathways and there are many different disciplines and backgrounds. I think we've really managed to land this idea that the field is fundamentally interdisciplinary and should continue to be interdisciplinary in nature. But then what comes next is a little bit what we have to work on. And I cite, the student said 3 things. We need ramps, as in we need those starting jobs, right? A lot of the times when you just graduate, you apply into the trust and safety field and people tell you well, if you haven't been doing child safety for 10 years, don't bother. And people are like, well, how would I, right? So building these ramps. Second thing is we need training. I think a lot of the thing that we all think is obvious, things that we all know are best practices, thing that everybody else is doing is very much up in our heads, and making sure that we can partner with some of the great organizations that were just on stage, right? With the Tech Coalition, with Thorn, with others in our field, to make sure those best practices are fully made available, that we can turn them into training, that we can explain what is it that we do, what is it that we've learned, I think is a fundamental part of what we still need to do. And the third thing that they're saying, again, full credit to them, I am just a vessel, is we need mentors. And so this is a plea to everybody in this room who is in a position to actually put out your hand and say, hey, I am in this field and I will help you. I will help you start your career. I will help you navigate those early opportunities. Earlier today, I'm sure some of you were at this amazing Cyber 912 Trust and Safety Challenge, where many of student teams competed on trust and safety scenarios, and all these student teams had coaches. Charles, who's somewhere in this room, agreed to coach the Columbia team, and it's amazing to see those people who are seasoned professionals say, I will coach, I will mentor. And so I encourage all of you who are in a position to do this to actually invest the time. It makes a meaningful difference.
No, I don't have anything more to add. I think the mentoring, but also doing it while you're at the company is so important, because I think that a lot of people don't understand that they can use their expertise outside of that very specific role that they're in. And they need people within a company as well. As we're thinking about the future leaders, they are the next generation. So taking someone who is an early stage applicant and matching them with someone who's a VP or someone a few levels above will really help expand their horizon.
I think the saying is, you can't be what you can't see.
Yeah.
I think it's so important to have that kind of visibility and extension of a hand to say, okay, I struggled through it. Let's try to reduce the struggle as much as possible. Big kudos, not because I work there, but All Tech is Human is great for that kind of space for mentorship. We have a whole mentorship program. We offer networking opportunities like these. There are so many opportunities to seek mentorship just in trust and safety because of the nonlinear sort of pathways into it. So seek out those kinds of opportunities through the TS Hackathon with Jeff Dunn. That's another good one. Trust and Safety Professional Association. These are all things you should research tonight.
The Integrity Institute
Integrity
also does
Institute.
great work.
Sahar,
TSP
Jeff, I
has
love
an
you.
amazing job board.
Yeah. So they do amazing work. I would love to stay on that because I think, it's hard. There's an art to diplomacy, but also an art to networking specifically. I feel like I meet people in the community. Some people have it down. Some people struggle. What do we say to those folks in the room that might say, that there's a struggle in community building around trust and safety? What would you say to those folks? Besides listing off these orgs, which are amazing.
Focus on building an actual relationship with someone instead of using them for a very transactional purpose.
Period. Period.
But then be decisive, right? If you're going after something, be decisive about who you are targeting. As someone who's an introvert, I do not like networking. The irony. But I have to be tactical. So think about how do you tactfully build a relationship with someone? Because you never know what's going to come from that. If someone doesn't do the same thing that you do or have the same interests, it doesn't mean that they can't introduce you to someone else. So remembering that everyone's human as well, I think is probably, those are my top tips as someone who detests networking.
Yeah, and I think on that note, don't assume that because somebody may be further along in their career that you don't have anything to tell them or to teach them. I don't have time to read everything. I'm not aware of every single thing that's happening in trust and safety. Be aware of how much is publicly available. Maybe there's not enough publicly available, but you'd be amazed at what you can pick up from media reports, from transparency centers, things like that. If you can spend some time, even if you're not working in a company, developing a point of view, developing a knowledge base about what's happening in the space. If you're comfortable reading academic literature, that's always a good thing to do, because then you can go into those conversations and have something deeper. Personally, I like to have conversations with people where they're enriching me in some way and not just asking me, for help. It's you're helping me. I'm learning too. I never want to stop networking and learning. So the more that you can kind of develop that iteratively, I think the better.
I really like that. When I was a diplomat in India, it was very intense. It was 2-3 cocktails a night. But you really have to kind of show up, because it's by country, and then if you don't show up, it's by rank. They kind of notice, and so I literally walk in the door, greet the ambassador and the wife, and now we just walk out and pretend I was just going to the ladies and never come back. But the thing is that what I did in those 10 years as a diplomat was basically we call them targets, right? We look at the list and say, okay, I want to maybe pick out 2 people. And also when we do parties, the same thing. You may not know this, but if we throw a party, we actually really want those 10 people in the room, and we're going to throw some other people around that's going to make it really sprinkly and beautiful and unicorn dust and gorgeous, and once they want to be there. I'm not kidding. During my time, it was a thing where people would be like, oh, embassy, were you invited? And it was a thing. But all that aside, we really have to be very targeted and then really know what we're looking for, to your point. And also to your other point as well, now being in academia, it was a very humbling experience. Yeah, sure, I want to look at taxonomy, network harassment. Where do I even begin, right? Find a data scientist, find an expert. It's actually at these conferences, these networking opportunities, that you can find your people, and you have to. And for me, it's you have to be humble. I don't know this. I am an economist. I know how to do this. How do I get connected in order to do this and this? And it was really through a whole steep learning curve. I started in May last year, and then I defended in just this past March. It's because of such gatherings. It's because of people like you out there, and then you can ask these questions, and then you go to see where it leads you. For me, it's just very simple, a Google check and then a LinkedIn thing, and see what you have in common. And then you just start from there over coffee. Be really sincere. And then I'm I need this and I need help, and how can I help you? Just those 2 very basic questions. And it has taken me so far.
Yeah, I agree. I treat networking like making friends. It's fun for me to talk to you all because it's not work. It's genuinely just being myself. And when the opportunity comes to help you, I know I have a friend that I'm helping. It's not like a transaction. And that's something, a skill that is really like underrated sometimes.
I will say though, for those of you who are introverts, there is also a space for you in this field. We're a kind field. We take all stripes.
That's right. I think we touched on this earlier. There's like an unintentionally adversarial narrative going on with ethical and non-ethical, or responsible tech. Does that mean the rest of the tech is irresponsible? We've talked about this. So, is this framing productive when you're in the market for a role? Is it real? Does it inform the way we deal with each other here? What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to, like, I think there are role definitions. Like, there are things that you will have to do in your role, and it may technically be more technical, or maybe you're more in a policy space and it's like just literally less technical. But I think as we were getting at before, like it is, I mean, this is, all tech is human is a good name, right? It's like, it's synonymizing, right? We're not creating barriers between these things. We're kind of trying to inject, make sure that technologists are building in ethics from the very beginning, and ethicists are thinking very deeply about how technology works to the extent possible.
Yeah, I think coming from a team that was called the governance team, right? We had to be very specific when we were thinking about that name, because we don't want to come off as we know best. Mm-hmm. We are here to learn. We are not public policy. We're just sort of at the intersection of trying to understand how do we create guardrails. And so that language was really helpful in terms of opening doors for people to understand that governance could actually be a good thing. But I think, going back to Jacob's point, like, all tech is human, it sets a really nice and crisp baseline, whereas we don't need to be adversaries, right? Like, tech is constantly evolving, and that's why we create guardrails, right? Which is not, it's almost like Teflon, in a sense, and I think language is so powerful, but the reason why governance and that team existed was because we were less obtrusive and scary to a lot of our product policy and legal teams, and even external XFN partners.
We didn't pay them to say that.
Well, let me take the sort of opposite direction here. I actually do think that the field is adversarial, and I think it's okay. I think that there are large portions of the field that are focused on understanding adversaries, mapping out how they react, coming up with mitigations, and then constantly adapting to that. And I think that is also an important thing for the next, set of leaders to know, which is, if you're excited by that, if you think it's kind of cool to think about adversaries and to, be a step ahead, if you like the cat and mouse game, maybe that's a good field for you, because this is absolutely part of what structures the field, is that sort of like passion for the adversarial thinking. And honestly, I think that makes a lot of things fun, right? Like the whole, for instance, practice of red teaming is about thinking about a product and thinking about, how am I going to break it? How am I going to fuck things up? And that's fun too. I think that's definitely part of our field. Now, does this need to translate into some of the relationships that we have internally is a different discussion. Can it get adversarial? Of course. That also means that part of your job as somebody who does trust and safety is to make sure that you don't end up in this sort of like very known failure case of, like, I am the village inside the house that is protesting and like, I will hold my bounds, right? Like, this is a known failure mode. You don't want to get that. Mm-hmm. But absolutely, I think that this adversarial dynamic is a structuring force in the field. And again, I think that tension brings also a lot of fun and also a lot of intellectual rigor in how we think about the problems that we're trying to tackle.
Also, if you want to look at this a bit in a broader way, because I was on the council, and now I'm in academia, and I see there's a bit of a gap sometimes, or a bit of adversarial stance between governments and tech companies, but also a gap between sort of like research work and a translation and policy making. So how do we the triangle? How can it work better together? How can we do that together? So for me, that's something that I'm still like grappling with.
Yeah, I was going to say I jailbreak. Oh, maybe I shouldn't say that. Okay. So I red team all of the open source LLM models weekly to understand what's happening with elections. And it's so much fun. And honestly, it's probably the best part of my day. And I take that and I analyze what I see and I create a trend report that goes up to VPs, et cetera. I wish that there were more roles like that. And I think it's identifying how can we create more roles that play into that at the companies instead of these roles being on the outside.
And what if this was the future of our industry? What if, similar to how cybersecurity has evolved, trust and safety is actually getting up and up the product development lifecycle by investing in those safety by design practices, which also means investing in structured red teaming. Here, what's really interesting and fun is that the advent of generative AI brings a whole new crop of people who are suddenly obsessed with red teaming. That's fun. That means we get to break more stuff and maybe think in a way that's more proactive and more design-centric about how we design those mitigations and bake them into the product that we're building. I really think that that wind is right now reshaping the industry, and I think there's going to be more and more roles like that. And again, we see this in those outputs, right? We were just here talking about this amazing Oltec and Human and Thorn safety by design for generative AI and child safety report. That's amazing. That's 50 pages of multiple companies who sat down and said, okay, yes, absolutely, we want to do red teaming and we want to do safety by design thinking. That, I think, is also a sign that our industry is at a pivotal time that's going to make it more fun and perhaps a little bit more effective at what we're trying to do, which is ultimately to make online spaces safer.
Yeah, no, I'm just glad the conversation went this way and that you brought back taking the sort of dirty word status away from adversarialism. If we zoom out, I mean, let's be real, we are seeing challenges in the trust and safety ecosystem that are somewhat rooted in the perception and maybe the reality that trust and safety is not about profit generation. In many cases, it is and is considered a cost center. You know, we can argue about how trust and safety actually makes the company's life easier by preventing PR crises and making the online space is actually a nice place for people to be in and look at ads or whatever. But we should recognize that we are, this is it. There is friction. This is a fight. This is a field that we also need to stand up for in a capitalist environment to say that this should exist in a very robust way anyway.
I think the oversight board needs to make a recommendation that if there's better funding for trust and safety.
No comment.
No comment. I'd love to leave it there. Please give a warm round of applause for our panel.